Today on Callahan's Garage, narrow beam, step-by-step how to install. Ready, set, go.
Hey, I'm Callahan. Welcome to Callahan's Garage.
All right, folks, welcome back to Callahan's Garage. My name is Callahan, and today we're going to install our new narrowed front end. So you can see we've got our crusty, nasty old stock front end in here still. We're going to yank this thing out, and we got a brand new 4-inch adjustable beam with shock tower, so we're going to get it installed into the car. So we got all of our suspension from the one and only Autowerks Suspension. Sam is absolutely one of my homeboys. He's been hooking me up with suspension stuff for years for both personal projects and customers. As far as air-cooled suspension stuff goes, in my book, Sam is as good as it gets. All brand new, made from scratch stuff. We got a 4-inch narrowed beam here with shock towers. We got the skid plate. He also hooked us up with our drop spindles. All new hardware for everything. So if you need any air-cooled suspension stuff, whether it's type 1, 2, 3, narrowed beams, air ride beams, off-road beams, Sam is a one-stop shop for all of it. So I'm going to put his info in the description and make sure you hit him up for all of your air-cooled suspension needs. So first things first, get your fuel tank out of the way. So if you have an earlier car, we're just going to have 4 bolts and a fuel line and a vent hose. Yank the whole thing out. If you've got a later model car, you'll need to undo your filler neck and the same thing. Couple of bolts, vent hose, fuel line underneath, get it out of the way. And that is going to allow us access to everything up here in the front end that we need to get to. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to undo our steering column. We're going to undo all of our tie rods and our steering damper, and then we'll be able to drop the whole front end out as one piece. So first things first, we're going to disconnect our steering column from our steering coupler and our steering box. In this case, I'm just going to disconnect the steering column. I will take this old coupler loose once we get the front end out and onto the table. So originally these are 14mm nuts and bolts. Sometimes they get changed out and they may be 13s. These also will have cotter pins in them. A lot of times these little tiny cotter pins are really hard to get out, especially if they're as crusty as mine are right now. So sometimes what's easier is to just break those cotter pins loose instead of trying to fight with them and get them out, and that makes it go a little bit quicker. So like I was saying, these can really be a pain in the butt to get off because it's kind of hard to get in here with a socket and a wrench or anything to really get on these, especially up here on the steering column where our bolt side, you can't really fit a socket onto this because it's too close to our arm here. So one thing you can do that makes this a little bit easier is you can take a wrench, put it on your nut, let the wrench sit against the body, and then you let the body hold the wrench. That way you can just put all of your force behind the one wrench, and that should turn and break that loose. So we've got that broken loose now. We can take it all the way off. Okay, so now you can see we got our steering column completely loose from our steering box. Like I said, we'll take this coupler off later once we get the car out. You also have the ground wire for your horn, so make sure you take that loose. And now we can take our tie rods and our steering damper loose. Okay, so we've just got a 15mm bolt on our steering damper. You just need to take it loose from the beam. You can leave it attached to the tie rod end. And then we've got 17mm nuts on each one of our tie rod ends. If they're old, they may have a castle nut with a cotter pin. If they've been replaced recently, they probably have a nylock nut. And a lot of times, if your tie rods are really worn out, these nylock nuts will be really tricky to get off because they'll just spin the ball joint instead of loosening the nut. So just be prepared for that. You may end up having to cut the nut off or cut the stem of the ball joint in order to get it loose. So then next we need to get our tie rod ends loose from our pitman arm and from our spindles. So you can use a pickle fork or a tie rod puller, something similar. I like to just use a hammer, a couple of quick wraps on the knuckle, and they'll typically pop right loose, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so we've got the nut off of our tie rod end already, and like I said, you can use a puller, you can use a pickle fork, there's a lot of different options for getting these loose. I usually just take a hammer. This is a very quick, easy way to do it, and if we hit right on the edge of our knuckle right here, a couple of good whacks, and this will pop loose. There we go. So we'll do the same thing to our pitman arm, and to our other side, we'll get all of our tie rods loose, and then we can just pull them out all together. So there we go. We got both of our tie rods out. I'm just going to throw these out. We are not going to reuse these. Anytime you install a narrowed front end, you're going to have to also have adequately narrowed tie rod ends. And when you buy a front end from Sam, he will supply you with brand new tie rods ends if you want them, with brand new tubing for the tie rods, rather than having to cut these and narrow these. And that's just not the best way to do it. So like I said, we got brand new ones. We're going to toss these out. Okay, so just a couple more things before we're ready to drop the complete front beam out of here. We need to disconnect our speedometer cable. It runs into the hub on your driver's side. So it just pokes out through the end of the dust cap here, and you'll either have a cotter pin or a little circle clip that'll just pop off, and then you can pull your speedometer cable loose out of the back of your hub and just set it aside. Then we need to undo our brake lines. If you already have good brake lines, obviously just disconnect them from your hard line up here. Mine are terrible, so I'm just going to chop them in half. Yeah, see how bad they are? Not even a drop of fluid came out of there. We got all new brake stuff to go in here. Okay, so we've got most everything disconnected. The only thing we have left are the physical bolts that hold the beam to the body and to the tunnel. So we've got 4 big bolts on the front, 2 bolts on the top. But before we do that, I'm going to reposition my jack stands. Currently they're under the beam, so we need to move them back so that we can get the beam out of the car. Okay, so we're ready to remove all our mount bolts. So we just have 2 17mm bolts on the top, and then we have 4 on our upright mounts that are directly underneath these, and we'll take a look at those in just a second. But I'm going to break these loose, and then what I like to do is just thread these back in a little bit so that these bolts will hold the front end into the car once we take our 4 big bolts underneath these loose. Okay, so we've gotten those broken loose, and like I said, we just threaded them back in a little bit so they're going to keep the beam from falling out when we take our other bolts out. So let's go underneath and get the big bolts out. Okay, so like we said, last thing to get the front end out, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of these big bolts that go through these upright mounts and into our frame head. So a lot of times these can be really hard to get off if they've never been out before. And we also had this little lock tab that goes behind it and keeps these from coming loose. Our tabs have already been folded down, so hopefully that means these have been out before and they won't be too hard to come out. So if you need to, fold these little lock tabs back, and then you can get a wrench on these and break all these loose. If you hear your threads creaking and groaning, make sure you just work these back and forth so you don't end up stripping out the threaded inserts in your frame head, because that is a nightmare. So as you can see, now our beam is just kind of hanging loose in there. Just those 2 top bolts are keeping this thing from falling out. So we're going to put a jack under here, support some of the weight. We'll take those 2 top bolts out, and then we can lower this thing down out of here as careful as we can. Just make sure you keep your feet out of the way. And it is helpful to have a second person to kind of hold this thing and steady it as you lower it down. But it's just me here today, so we're just going to do it live. Here we go. There we go. Beautiful. Okay, so there we go. We got our stock beam totally out. We're going to throw this thing up on the table and do a little bit of disassembly. We need to get our steering box off. We're going to reuse it. And I think these torsion arms are going to clean up a little bit better than the other ones I have. So we're going to take them off. We'll get everything blasted, cleaned up, painted, and then we'll be ready to start putting our new front end into the car. So there's a few things that we have to get off of our old beam in order to transfer over to our new beam. So we're going to start with the steering box, and to remove your steering box, we just have two 17mm nuts. These also have a lock tab, so you're going to have to hammer this lock tab open. Then we can take off our nuts and this clamp will come loose. You do not have to take off the pitman arm in order to remove and replace the steering box. So there's no reason to pull this off unless you have a new steering box, you're going to blast this and paint it or anything like that. So we're going to take these off, we'll get the steering box out of here, then we will move on to removing our spindles, our brakes, and our trailer arms. So next we can pull off our shocks, and I'm going to go ahead and pull the spindle and the drum off all in one piece. So we got 17mm for our shocks, upper and lower, and then the same thing, we have a 17mm bolt and nut on our pinch bolts for our link pins. So we'll take both of these loose, and then we'll be able to pull the spindle off of our torsion arms. So now that we've got the pinch bolts on our link pins in here, we can drive our link pins out of the arm and take the whole spindle off of here. A lot of times these really get stuck in here, so you may have to take like a chisel and drive in between your torsion arms here. So we can just do like this, take a little bit of the tension off of there, and then our link pins will move a lot more freely. Let's see if we can't get this whole thing off. Whew, those are in there. Grab me one more chisel. There we go. So now that our spindles and our brakes are off and out of the way, we're going to move on to getting our torsion arms off now. So to get our torsion arms off, we have a 19mm jam nut, and then we have an 8mm Allen head bolt that goes in and locks onto our torsion spring. And a lot of times these are just completely covered in old grease and crud. So you'll have to kind of get a screwdriver, get a chisel or something, and scrape these clean enough to where you can actually get onto them. You can see this one isn't even visible, there's so much crud on it. And then take your pick tool and clean out down in that Allen head bolt so that you can actually get your Allen head socket down in there to get it to break loose. You absolutely don't want to go stripping this out and then not be able to get it off. This one is just absolutely packed full of crud. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is crack loose our jam nut here. And then if you're lucky, that will spin the Allen head bolt out with it. And that's exactly what's happening here. So you can see the whole thing just comes out. Now this torsion arm is loose, we can hammer it off of here. So we'll go ahead and dig this one out and then we'll knock both of them off of here. So once you get those jam bolts off of here, you should be able to knock these off pretty easy. If your beam has gotten dry and doesn't have a lot of grease in it, they may be a little difficult to knock off, but they should come out pretty easily. Just kind of hammer on them and pull them out. Oh no. There we go. We got a little stuck on our outer bearing out here, but Came out pretty clean. These look pretty good. I think these are going to clean up nicely for us. And then your top one is sitting on your bump stop here, so it may take a little bit more effort to get it off. And once it swings off of that bump stop, you can pretty much just pull it out. All right, so we'll do the same thing to the other side, get it completely torn down, and then we can clean up everything that we need to reuse. All right, so we've got our beam completely torn down to where we need it. Every time you install a narrowed beam, you're also gonna need narrowed torsion springs. So at this point, you may need to pull these out, clean them off, and get them sent out as cores, or you may need to hold on to these and cut them down once you get your new beam installed. Okay, so we've got our first torsion arm cleaned up, and on the lower torsion arms, almost every single time you take these apart, the steel shock bushing is going to stay stuck on our lower shock mount here. So these can be really tricky to get off. Sometimes you can grab them with a pair of vice grips and spin it and get it to come off. Most of the time you're going to have to take a cutoff wheel and cut kind of a slit in it just to relieve some pressure, and then we can get a chisel, bust that crack open, and then we'll be able to pull this thing off. So I'm going to do that on this arm, and then once we get the other one cleaned up, we'll do the same thing. So you can see, like I was saying, we just cut kind of a spiraled shaped slit in this thing, and that allowed us to split it most of the way. And then you can chisel it off or hammer it off, whatever you need to do. And now we can get our shock mount cleaned back up, and we'll get some paint on this thing. Okay, so we got fresh paint on our beam, we got our grease fittings installed and everything. This thing's ready to go into the car. A lot of people will be inclined to go ahead and fully assemble the beam at this point. If you're doing this by yourself, I would not recommend that. It just becomes huge and cumbersome and really difficult to get under the car and up into position and bolt it in and everything. So I like to put the beam in the car, then we'll put our torsion arms on, we'll put our spindles on, and we'll fully dress this thing out. So let's go throw this thing up under the car. Okay, so we've got our beam down here ready. Before you go stick your beam up in here, remember to make sure you put your body bushings on top of our upper beam mounts here. You will not be able to get those in after you get the beam in place, so don't forget those. I've also got brand new beam bolts to hold this thing up in here. So basically all we're going to do is just get up under here, pick this thing up, hold it in place. Once you get it set up against the frame head, it's going to kind of hold itself in place. You can pretty much just hold it there with one hand, and then take your other hand and get a couple of your bolts started. There we go. Okay, so now that I've got it shoved up into place, I've literally just holding it up here with one finger. I can take my bolts and get some of these started to hold it up in here. Then I'm just going to go ahead and run the top ones all the way tight, and then the bottom ones I'm going to leave loose because we still are going to put a skid plate up on the bottom of this. And when you're tightening these up, just like anything else, you know, you want to kind of run them all in a little bit before you tighten any one of them fully down. That way we still got a little bit of wiggle room if we need it. And then we've got our 2 top beam bolts we can put back on. So again, we've got a bushing and our big square washer that goes there. And then we'll just run our bolt down into the top of these. Okay, so we got our beam installed last night. We're almost ready to start dressing it back up. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disassemble my brakes. And you may or may not need to do this for your particular project. We have new drop spindles, so we don't need to use our old spindles. But we are going to be running the original drum brakes on the front of this car for the time being. So we need to get the backing plates and the drums off of here. The rest of this we're not going to use. We got all new brake guts and everything. So I'm going to tear these apart, and then keep in mind, if you're having drop spindles built, you will need the carriers off of your original spindles. So hang on to these so that you can send them off as cores or whatever you need to do. I don't recommend rebuilding your kingpins unless you've done it before. It's kind of a tricky job. You need a couple of specific things to do it. But a lot of providers like Sam offer fully built kingpin spindles ready to go. So that's what I've got here. If you have a later model ball joint car, you don't have to fool with this at all. You can just bolt your new spindle straight up to your torsion arms. Okay, so we got our spindles and our brakes all broken down. Like I said, if you need to send your spindles off as cores, do that. I like to just keep a set of these on hand. That way, when I order my new drop spindles, I already have some I can go ahead and send out. So I'm going to throw these on the shelf. We'll get our backing plates and our drums all cleaned up. We've got to reuse some of this hardware, so we'll get it cleaned up as well. So I think now we're ready to start putting our beam back together. Okay, so we're ready to put our torsion arms back onto our spring packs here. And these are pretty straightforward, just like we took them off. We're just going to lube these up so they'll slide in nice and easily. And then you want to just make sure that your spring pack is oriented correctly so that your dimple is going to land correctly on the side where our pinch bolt is. And then we can just throw these up in here. And sometimes these can be a little tricky to get in. Sometimes they're a little tight, but lubing them up helps a lot. And then once you get them to where they're almost all the way on the spring pack, just kind of wiggle it around and work this thing on there. And then you can just tap it all the way on. Get our excess grease off of here so we don't make a mess before we get started. And then before we run our pinch bolt in here, I'm going to go to the other side and make sure that my spring packs are tapped in evenly. That way we make sure everything seats up correctly in here. And then we can take our grub screw and just run it into the top of our trailing arm here. Make sure we get that good and snug. And then we'll tighten up our jam nut. All right, so that's on there. The main thing when you're putting these on, you just want to make sure that they seat all the way, and that'll help our grub screw to lock them in place. And then same thing for our lower arms. Just slide it on in there. That one actually went on pretty easy. Got it fully seated on there. Okay, so next we can throw our new shocks up in here. We've got lowered MP shocks. I've never had an issue with these. Like, they're not the best, not the worst. They'll work fine for this application. So we'll throw these in here and then we can start putting our steering back together. Okay, so now we're ready to start hooking up our steering. First thing we're gonna do is put our steering box back in. Like I said before, there's no need to take the pitman arm off of here. We can weasel it in here all still together. So you just kind of go in from the top and twist down into here. Get it set basically in place. So we've got our steering box set in place and I've got my clamp onto the bottom and you can see this thing's kind of just loose still here. So we want to get our steering coupler hooked up between the two before we lock down the location of our steering box. So we'll get this in here. Just get everything hooked back up the same as it was. Make sure that you remember the washer with the spade terminal to hook your ground wire back up to. Okay, so now I'm going to tighten all this up and we'll get this completely fixed in its location and then we'll tighten down our steering box. So a lot of your aftermarket beams will not have the tabs to locate your steering box on there, and that's because every single one of these cars is going to end up being a little bit different, whether the car's been hit or tweaked or whatever, so it's hard to guarantee exactly where the steering box location is going to land. So that's kind of the way we do it in this order. Leave the steering box loose, tighten all this up to inform the location of your steering box, make sure your angle of your steering column is right, and then lock down your steering box. Okay, so now we've got our steering coupler fully hooked back up. Our steering box is still loose, but as you can see, we just want to make sure that our angle this way is correct, and then our angle this way is correct. We want everything to be nice and straight so that as this rotates, our steering coupler doesn't bind up or anything. It just moves smoothly and there's no weird angles or anything. If you have a weird angle, it's going to make it feel like there's a tough spot in the steering. So your steering should still move totally smooth and everything. And now we'll go underneath and we'll lock down our clamp to hold our steering box in place. Okay, so now that we got our steering box back in, we can put our new steering damper and our new tie rods in. And these are just going to go in the same way that they came out, nice and easy. Got a nut on each end, bolt it all up to our pitman arm, and then once we get the spindles on, we'll hook them up to our spindles. Okay, so we've got our beam pretty much all together. The last thing we need to do is install our spindles, and we can put our brakes and our hubs and everything on. So with your king and link pin spindles, there is some setup that we have to do regarding how we shim the link pins. So there's a series of shims you have to place on the inside and the outside of the pin here in order to get our camber set correctly. And we do this based on the offset of the torsion arm. So I'm going to show you how to measure that, and then we'll get these set up. Okay, so to set up our shims, we first need to determine the offset between our upper and our lower torsion arm. So we're going to have to measure that so we can take a nice straight edge and put it onto our lower torsion arm. And then what we're doing is we're measuring this gap in between our straight edge and our torsion arm. And currently this is sitting right about 6 millimeters. So now we can take this measurement and reference the chart that comes with your link pin kit, and that'll tell us how to set the shims up. Okay, so now that we've measured the offset of our torsion arms, we're ready to set up the shims on our link pins. So you can see we're going to have a series of shims on the outside of our link pin, and then we're going to have a series on the inside of our link pin. So we'll set up our shims on the outside, push it through our kingpin carrier, and we'll put our inner shims on this side. So all you have to do is consult the chart. Like I said, in this case we have a 6 millimeter offset. So on our upper link pin, we are doing 6 outer shims and 2 inner shims on our upper link pin, and then on the bottom link pin we're doing 4 on each side. So we'll put all of our shims on here. Once you have your shims on, we still need to install the crush washer and the O-ring, and this is what seals up our kingpin on the torsion arm side and keeps all of our grease inside of our kingpin here. So it'll go just like this. We'll take our O-ring, we'll put it onto our link pin, and then the shim will go over that O-ring. You can see it's got a recess to seal up against that O-ring. And then also note that this crush washer has a notch in it. That notch has to orient correctly on our torsion arms in order to hold everything in place correctly. So now this is fully set up, it's ready to go onto our torsion arms. Okay, so you can see I've gone ahead and I've driven a couple of wedges into my torsion arms again, and that's just gonna make it a little bit easier to slide these link pins in here. And a lot of times these arms may be separated or closed up a little bit, so you may have to pull on them to get them totally lined up so everything will slide in. But once we get these slid in, like I said, we want to make sure that this inner washer lines up with our notch in the torsion arm correctly. So kind of go slow, watch it, make sure that you get those both lined up. And then once they're lined up, we can push this in all the way and put our pinch bolts in here. There we go. So now we can put our new cinch bolts in here. And in order to get these in here, we're gonna have to rotate the link pin. So the link pin has an eccentric groove in it that allows us to snug it up once the bolt's all the way through. So you can just take your wrench, put it on the back side of the link pin and rotate this thing until it lines up correctly so that the bolt will fall in. Sometimes you may have to just look at it and eyeball it to get it in the right spot. So right there, now our bolt will go in. Do the same thing on the bottom. And now we will snug both of these up, and once we get them snugged up, we're going to adjust our link pins to make sure they're nice and snug. Okay, so now that we have our bolts snugged up, what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this link pin. So what we want this to do is pull in and take up all of the slack from our shims here. So you can see if we spin it this way, it's going to move this link pin out slightly. So we're going to rotate it the other way until it pulls all that slack out, get it just snugged up a little bit, and then we'll tighten our cinch bolt all the way down. Do the same thing on the top. Make sure you're going the right way. Just get it snugged up and tighten it down. So now our link pins are fully set up. We can get them greased up. We'll put our backing plate and our drums and our hubs on here. Okay, so previously we got all our brakes torn down, so we've got the drums off of the backing plates and everything already. The backing plates are cleaned up, ready to go back on. Before we clean up the drums, I'm going to go ahead and pull our seal and our inner bearing out. And then we'll wipe all the old grease out of here, get these cleaned up, and repack them with our new bearings and races. old seal, old bearing, straight into the trash. So I'm gonna wipe this out and then we'll drive out the old races. So now we're going to drive out our old races. So in order to do this, we just need a decent sized chisel and a hammer with a little bit of heft to it. So we can just go in here, get on the edge of our race and tap it out. And just try to make sure you don't gouge into the side of your hub. And you can see for the outer race, you're going to have to sit your drum up on some blocks or something so that the race will actually knock all the way out. So there we go. We got our outer race out. We're going to get our inner race out, and then we'll do the same thing to the other drum. Okay, so we're getting our front brakes set up. I got one already all together. The front drum brakes are even easier than the rear brakes. So if you saw the video where we did step by step through those, these are just as easy. So we'll throw our wheel cylinder on here. We've got our adjusters cleaned up. We just need to put some anti-seize on them. We can get our shoes on here. And now we can put the retainer pins for our shoes on. We did end up having to reuse the original springs for these. The ones that came in this kit were way too long. So throw these on here and then we can go throw both of these on the car. Good to go. Okay, so we got our new bearings and races installed into our hubs. We got them packed with grease. We got them loaded up, all ready to go. New wheel seals in the back of them. So we're ready to go put these on the spindles. Doing wheel bearings is pretty straightforward. If you've never done it before, just go ahead and get yourself a nice little bearing packer that makes it a million times easier. A nice little driver set for getting your races in makes it a million times easier. And then make sure you're using a good quality grease. I really like this Lucas green grease. It's really heavy duty, works really well on everything. I run it on my big truck and everything, and it holds up a really long time. But otherwise, just make sure you get enough grease packed into your hub, and then make sure your bearings are fully packed. One of the biggest mistakes people make with this is not loading the hub up with grease. And you can see how much grease I was grabbing and gobbing down into this thing. So load your hubs up and then make sure you pack your bearings effectively. Okay, so now we can put our hubs on here. These should just slip on pretty straightforward. With our new brakes unadjusted, we should be able to just weasel these right on here. Make sure your bearing gets seated all the way up on there. And once our hub's on there, we can put our lock nuts on through it. So we've got a big washer that goes on here. And then with the link pin cars, we have our two big nuts out here. If you have a later model car, you'll just have the one nut that has the cinch bolt on it. And this is where a lot of people will mess this up. They will either not tighten this nut enough or they will over tighten it. So the way I've always done it is I'm just going to tighten this up, and I'm going to kind of rotate it as I tighten it and get it pretty tight, and spin this for a second, let that bearing get good and seated. And then I'm going to back this off a little bit and then just snug it back up. So now it spins really nice and free. There's no play or anything in our bearing. And then we can take our lock tab and put it on here. If your lock tab is broken, make sure you get a new one. So we have this tab in the center that goes into the keyway on our spindle, and then we have both of the ears to lock our nuts down. So this should just press into place. Sometimes you may need to use your nut to kind of force it down in there. And the main thing is, when we're tightening this outer one down, we don't want to tighten our inner nut any further. So once you get this tight, you may need to grab another wrench in order to hold that inner nut in place. There we go. And then we can fold these ears down to lock on our nuts. We can throw our dust cover back on here. Okay, so we got our brakes and our hubs and everything on here now. Remember, on the driver's side, to hook your speedometer cable back up. You can see I've just got a little piece of welding wire through here. I couldn't find a cotter pin small enough. So that'll work. And now we can get our brake lines, our new master cylinder in here, and we are almost ready to set this thing down. Okay, so you can see we got all our brake stuff finished up. We got our new flex lines, all new hard lines up here. We got a new hard line running to the back, new master cylinder, new brake light switch. We got our reservoir hooked up, and you can see we had to improvise a little bit, add a little piece of hose because we have the newer style inlet on our master cylinder. But the brakes are all wrapped up now. I've got them fully adjusted, so we just need to bleed the brakes. Then we can throw our gas tank back in here, and we're almost ready to set this thing back down on the ground. So like I said, we're about to bleed the brakes out, then we can get our suspension fully adjusted and finally get this thing set on the ground. So let's look at the front end and I'll show you how to make the adjustments there. Okay, so most of your aftermarket adjustable beams are going to use an adjuster that looks like this, and there are different style adjusters, but this is kind of the most common one that you're going to see, and it's very straightforward. We just have two jam nuts here. If we loosen both of these nuts up, it's going to allow us to make our adjustments. So you can take your 19mm wrench, loosen both of these up. This lower one, once this is loose, it's going to allow this adjuster bolt to run up or down to make your height adjustments. If you forget to loosen this center jam nut on our grub screw, it's not going to allow this torsion block to rotate correctly, and it'll be kind of tricky to get your adjustments dialed in. So make sure you remember to loosen this one up. So we can loosen this bottom nut up, and then we can take our 6mm Allen wrench and just run this up or down to make your adjustments. Running this up is going to raise the car, and as you can see, mine's run pretty far down, so we're going to have a pretty low ride height. And then once you get your adjustments made and get your height dialed in, remember to tighten both of your jam nuts back up. All right, well, there we go. We got the car back on the ground. We got our suspension height fully dialed in. We got everything adjusted the way we want it. I'm really happy with the height that the car is sitting at now. We've done a couple of test drives, and we actually ended up having to raise the front of the car back up about a half an inch or so, just because the suspension kind of settled in after the car drove around and kind of loaded and unloaded the suspension. And that's super common. So just keep that in mind when you're making your final adjustments on your suspension. Make sure you're actually moving the car around, driving it around if you can, weighting the suspension, unloading the suspension, and really allow the car to move around and settle in as you're getting those final adjustments fine-tuned. So if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope this has been informative. We are going to keep doing some more work on this thing in the future. So like I said before, if there's any specific how-tos you want to see on the Beetle stuff, put it in the comments. If you have any specific questions about suspension, put it in the comments as well, and I do my best to get back to you. But this thing's ready for the road. I've already driven it to work once. We're going to go put some miles on this thing, and I will see you guys next time.